Good Yontef, good Yor Alamin, und Bruchim Aboim to Nusakh Vilna. Welcome everyone to Nusakh Vilna, Lashona Toive. This is YIVO's hosting of, I believe, the 68th annual Nusakh Vilna meeting. Elye, you can tell me if that's correct or not. I hope it's not. Good. YIVO, as I said, is hosting this. If YIVO has many online programs, classes, all kinds of fantastic things that you can avail yourself of if you go to yivo.org. Today's event is, as I said, the annual Nusakh Vilna meeting, which commemorates the Jewish community of Vilna through poetry and music. And today's event will, in particular, feature a remembrance of Chayele Palevesky, and in addition to that, a conversation that reflects on the overlooked agency of women as resistance fighters, with a particular focus on Vilna and its Jewish and political culture. And that features Judy Battalion, who has written a wonderful new book called The Light of Days. Participating today are Elye Palevsky. Elye is the CEO Emeritus of the nationally honored River Garden Senior Services and the River Garden Hebrew Home, and the developer of its campus in Jacksonville, Florida. Elye has taught Yiddish language and literature at Queens College and at the Yiddish Institute summer program at Vilnius University, where he also served as program director. Elye is the son of Chayele Palevsky and Shimon Palevsky, Oleh Sholem. Both were partisans in the woods around Vilna, both served as chair of Nusakh Vilna. In their honor, Elye has for the past years helped organize this very event with YIVO. Also with us today is Rivka Augenfeld, who came to Montreal, Canada in 1948 as a 2-year-old stateless child. She was born to Liba from Vilna and David from Warsaw, both of who joined partisans in the Vilna ghetto and then met during the year they spent in the Nara forests, then in Poland, now in Belarus. Rivka grew up in a secular Yiddish environment, the Workman's Circle, the Bund, and the Montreal Jewish Public Library. And from an early age began performing recitations of Yiddish poetry at various cultural venues, including many Holocaust commemorations. She was subsequently involved in the planning of many such events. A staunch advocate for the human rights of refugees, she has worked for over 45 years in the field of refugee and immigrant resettlement. Lastly, we have Judy Battalion, who I know best as Ellie's sister. But she was born and raised in Montreal, where she grew up speaking English, French, Yiddish, and Hebrew. She studied the history of science at Harvard and then moved to London to pursue a PhD in art history. Battalion has written essays and articles for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vogue, The Forward, Salon, the Jerusalem Post, and many other publications. Her stories about family relationships, the generational transmission of trauma, pathological hoarding, and militant minimalism came together in her book, White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between. Her latest book, The Light of Days, the untold story of women resistance fighters in Hitler's ghettos, received a Canadian Jewish Literary Award just last week. And this is what it looks like, and you should all go out and buy it. We are going to start today with Elye and a remembrance about his mother. So please, Elye.
I danke dir, Eddy, und ein gut, siehst gesund, Jahr allemen. Normal rede ich halb Jiddisch, halb Englisch, aber ich kann sehen, wie viel von euren verstehen. Generally, I speak half in Yiddish and half in English when I can tell face-to-face who in the audience understands. Bet you'll forgive me. We're going to be speaking largely in Yiddish during this program, except for pieces of poetry and song. Eddy, du sei mir Meuchel, sei sehr gut. Es ist Tage 58 Jahre. Okay.
58 Jahre. Okay, now.
68 Jahre. Yeah.
Okay, good. That's bin ich gewinn gerecht.
Hey, one, in 1953, before ever there was an official Yom HaShoah, let alone Holocaust museums, when not only the world at large told survivors of the Holden to move on, but also the Jewish establishment wanted them to move on. A group of Vilna, many of them Holocaust survivors, formed the organization Nusakh Vilna in the mode of Vilna, not only to memorialize their murdered brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, and the destruction of Vilna, Yerushalayim, Gilita, the intellectual capital of Jewish Eastern Europe, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to draw from Vilna's rich historical and cultural legacy to help enrich the lives they were about to begin to rebuild here in America, in North America, in Canada, throughout the world. Among those founders of Nusakh Vilna were my parents, Shimon and Chayele Palevsky, both who also eventually served as chair of the organization and oversaw its absorption by YIVO. Tomorrow is the first yortzeit of my mother, Chayele Palevsky. Until last year, at age 98, she was still reviewing last year's program for Nusakh Vilna and had to give her hechshel before I told Alex Weiser that we could proceed as planned. Chayele, going from a privileged, sheltered childhood in Svincian, after losing her family through stories too intricately involved to tell now, joined the partisans in Naroch, served in ways she could never have imagined, survived beyond any expectation, came to the United States with her fellow partisan, Shimon Palevsky, who had already lost a wife and child. Together they rebuilt a life, and together they rebuilt a Jewish world to give that life rootedness, including the culture of Vilna. But while she was up in years, mother, anticipating that at some point she would leave this world, in her hand left me a note, wenn es wird kommen die Zeit, soll man das verschreiben auf mein Matzeve. When the time comes, I want this to be written on my grave, the epitaph. And I will read. We added 3 lines. She wrote Chaya Porus, her maiden name. Gesellschaftliche Touren, we added Balipte Freu Mame Bode, Machnis Orchim Unvergleich, beloved mother and wife and grandmother, a community activist, and an offer of hospitality without parallel. And she wrote, a Partisaner Kämpferin gegen Nazism. Es führen Wegen zu Panar zu. Endlich bin ich zusammen mit euch, liebe Mame Malke, Tate Elye, Schwester Rochel und Rivke, Bruder Hirschele, umgebrachte durch die Nazi-Mörder auf Panar, April 5, 1943. In her words, who is Chaya Porus? I'm a partisan fighter against Nazism. At last, all the roads are leading to Panar, quoting from his song, Stiller, Stiller. At last, I'm with you, my beloved mother, Malke, my beloved father, Elye, my brothers, Herschele, my sisters, Rivka, Rochel, murdered by the Nazis in Panar, April 5th, 1943. That was her face to the world as she wished to be remembered. So given that wish, I asked Alex to get permission from the Museum of Jewish History to play a brief video which describes Chayele as she would be remembered around an artifact she gave to that museum. So Jane, if you would, please.
We're very in this iteration, this new version of the Auschwitz exhibition. We're very fortunate in this iteration, this new version of the Auschwitz exhibition that formerly was created for Madrid. When we've moved here and have this wonderful partnership with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, not only have we been entrusted with this venue and this opportunity to share this history with New Yorkers and others visiting the city, but also to draw upon the rich archives, the very powerful artifacts and objects, the stories from the Museum of Jewish Heritage collection. And one of those, which has deepened and enriched and made even more powerful our exhibition, is a blouse that was owned by a young woman in a ghetto just about 60 miles or so north of Vilnius in Lithuania, German-occupied Lithuania. This blouse was hand-embroidered by Rachel Poros's sister, Chaya. And Chaya gave it to Rachel as a present in the ghetto. And I think it created posed for me a particularly interesting, challenging, difficult curatorial problem, because where do you place this blouse? Is the story we want to tell the story of the ghetto, of this sisterly love and this present that's given? That's powerful. Is it, though, the story of Rachel herself, who was a registered nurse and who tended the sick in the ghetto? This is a story we need to show the visitor, that people not only resisted and showed resilience in many ways, but helped others also in the most dreadful circumstances. Or is the story of this blouse the fact that on the liquidation of the ghetto, the family, along with others from that ghetto, were sent on a train towards Vilnius, but actually that was not to be their final destination. The people were taken to a place called Portnoy, a forested area shortly a little way outside of Vilnius, where they were forced to strip and they were murdered into mass graves, mass pits. And this is the story of the Einsatzgruppen and the shootings and the killings. 1.5 million or so Jewish people and 200,000 or more, 250,000 Roma and Sinti people were murdered in this way. Rachel Poros was one of them. But we still have the blouse. And the reason we have the blouse is that a young woman, a friend of the family, who was given the dreadful job of sorting the belongings of the dead, recognized this blouse and rescued it, and managed to smuggle it into the Vilnius ghetto, where Chaya, the sister who had embroidered it, had escaped to, and jumped off a train and actually got herself into this ghetto area and receives the blouse of her murdered sister. Is that the story we tell? Or is the story that Chaya herself was wearing this blouse when she escaped from the Vilnius ghetto and joined the partisans in the forests, one of 30,000 Jewish partisans who fought the Nazis from the forests of Eastern Europe, and wore this in memory of her sister and carefully stitched and repaired it during those years of combat and resistance. And now, of course, that memory that she kept alive is something which we try to do justice to and to tell again inside the Auschwitz exhibition.
Thank you, host. Sorry. Sorry, I was saying that very moving story about the Palevsky blouse. We'll now start a conversation about Judy Battalion's new book, which is the story of female resistance fighters in the ghettos and camps during the Holocaust. Let me just start out by asking Judy how, obviously you'd written previously about familial trauma and how it's handed down over the generations. How did you wind up discovering this material and decide what you should do with it?
Thank you so much. Before I begin my spiel, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining today. I've attended this event in person a number of times in the past, and I know what a dedicated and insightful community this is. So I'm very honored to be here, in particular, remembering Elye Palevsky And also everyone on this panel has been so helpful in my work and in my research. So I thank you all so much, and I'm honored to be here alongside you. Now, to come back and answer your question, how did I begin to write about Jewish women in the underground? And the answer is completely by accident. My project started almost 14 years ago. I was living in London at the time, and it was a time in my life where I was thinking a lot about my Jewish identity. I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors from Poland. And I was thinking a lot about what I call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma transmits over generations, how it trickles down. I myself am a very anxious person. And it was just a time in my life where everything felt very dangerous to me. And I began to wonder how much of that was shaped by my Holocaust heritage. How had my family's experience affected how I responded to, how I reacted to everyday danger? And at the time, I was actually doing a lot of performing and comedy work. I used to be funny. And I decided to write a piece about this, a performance piece about Jewish women who had confronted danger. And the first one to come to mind was, I wanted it to have a historical backbone. So I was thinking of historical figures. And the first one I thought of was someone I had studied in Jewish day school in Montreal in 5th grade. And her name was Hannah Senesh. Probably most people here know about Hannah Senesh, but for those who don't, Hannah Senesh was a Hungarian Jew who in the 1930s made Aliyah, moved to what was then Palestine, became a poet and a lyricist. But during World War II, she decided she wanted to fight back. She joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper, and she volunteered to return to Nazi-occupied Europe to fight the Nazis. She was caught actually very early on, and legend has it, she looked her executioners in the eye when they shot her. I grew up with Hannah Senesh as a symbol of Jewish female courage, of Jewish bravado. But back 14 years ago in 2007, I didn't want to know about Hannah Senesh, the symbol. I wanted to know about Hannah Senesh, the person. Like, who does that? Who chooses to fight the Nazis? What poet decides to jump out of airplanes? What motivates that courage, that conviction, that passion? I was interested in the psychology, in what her personality was. This led me to the British Library, where I looked up Hannah Senesh in the catalog. I was looking for a nuanced biography of her, not just the sort of hero narrative that I had grown up with. There were not many books about Hannah Senesh, so I just ordered whatever they had. And one of the books that came back in my stack was quite unusual. It was an old book with yellowing pages and a blue fabric cover with gold embossed writing. And it was in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But even more unusual, I always say, is the fact I speak Yiddish. So I start looking through this book, looking for Hannah Senesh, but I can't find her. She's only in the last few pages. In front of her are stories of dozens and dozens of young Jewish women who fought the Nazis and who fought them primarily from the ghettos in Poland. And I will tell you that about a third of these stories were from Vilna. These were tales of Jewish women, and in particular from Vilna, who blowing up trains and acquiring weapons, and the chapter titles were ammunition and partisan combat. I had never read anything like this in tone, in content. I was simply stunned. And this is how it began. And this is really what set off for me what ended up being 12 years of research into the stories of the underground in Poland, and in particular, women's roles in the underground. And in my book, I really tried to show a diverse array of female activity in the resistance, ranging from young Jewish women who ran soup kitchens and underground schools, and who, ran printing presses. They used to smuggle bulletins by braiding them in their hair, all the way through to young Jewish women who shot Gestapo men in the head, who blew up, as I was saying, Nazi supply trains and electric grid. This was in Vilna, to young Jewish women who were ghetto fighters, flinging Molotov cocktails in uprisings, blowing up Nazi tanks. Many of the women I talk about as well had this role called couriers, in Hebrew, keshariot, connectors. These were young Jewish women who slipped in and out of ghettos, connecting these Jewish communities, bringing information, bringing bulletins, bringing fake Aryan papers, money, supplies, and weapons. It was often young Jewish women who were sent out to acquire, to buy, and smuggled back weapons, ammunition, explosives into the ghettos. That is what I deal with through the book. And my story takes place across Poland because, as I said, many of these women were the ones connecting the Jewish communities. And many of them were in Warsaw, many of them were in the Southwest, and many of them were in Vilna. And here, I would like to open it and ask both Rivka and Elye to talk a bit about their mothers' experiences in Vilna. Something obviously that was very, very important to me was to understand the psychology. Why join the resistance? Why do this? Why fight? What motivates that bravery? And I wondered perhaps we could start with you, Rivka, if you could tell us a little bit about why your mother joined the underground. How did that happen? What happened? What is the story of the initiation? What catalyzed her joining the partisans?
Well, thank you. First of all, I can't resist answering a question that's in the chat. The red book is a grown-up book, and the blue book is the young adult version, for those who have young adults that want to read this. I grew up with these stories. I find it endlessly fascinating and also sad at the same time that at the very same moment that you were growing up in Montreal, I had grown up with these stories of partisans, these stories of Vilna before the war, the stories of youth movements. They were all part of my daily fare, if you will, in a very positive way. So the answer, first of all, I mean, it doesn't pertain to everybody. My mother grew up in the secular Yiddish Vilna. She went to one of the top Yiddish secular first high school, elementary schools, and then high schools. Her father was a teacher, her mother was a teacher and a nurse, but very young, she joined the Bund youth movement. She joined the SCIF and then the Zukunft. And as you point out in your book, these youth movements, these right across the spectrum, I don't know if people can imagine today how many nuances there were in these youth movements, a whole range from very extreme left to extreme right in the Zionist movement, and the same in the non-Zionist movement. I don't think anyone now could possibly sit down and understand why somebody decided that being this kind of Zionist versus another kind of Zionist was important. And so they were already trained with pride, but also with the idea of standing up for oneself, of Jewish pride, of doikite, and all of these youth movements also had summer camps. They had training at various activities which helped them survive later on, but also at this great fidelity, this great loyalty to your group, and this trust. And I think generally, and it's one of my topics, affiliation, being affiliated and having people who know who you are, and even people you've never met, but the minute you tell them, I was in the SCIF and the Zukunft, they know who you are. And that helped. So already within the ghetto, as soon as people started getting organized, my mother, who was people who know her will tell you, was a very peaceful person, a very sweet person, but felt this need to participate, to not be passive, and to do something. And the Bund, first of all, and the Bund's connection to the partisan movement allowed her to find the steps to take to be accepted. But I think what people need to know, and I'll stop there, is that you couldn't just decide to be a partisan. You had to be accepted as a partisan. It was very conspiratorial. It was very dangerous. And so when she applied, she was interviewed, and she was interviewed by one of the commanders. She was barely 20 years old, and she told the story, which has been corroborated, that when he interviewed her, he ended up in tears saying, look how tragic it is that a young girl like this is telling me how she wants to fight and kill Nazis. But she was accepted, as were the others. And that was a point of pride always.
Touching. Elye, do you want to speak a bit about your parents' experiences?
Yeah, I will. And then I have a question for Judy. So while my father came out of the Bund and was already a known Bundist operative in Vilna and then in the ghetto, and lost a wife and child before he joined the partisans, my mother was this sheltered, privileged young lady in Svincian who went to Vilna with her boyfriend, Shikit, jumped off of the train that was supposed to go to Portnoy, wound up in the ghetto before the ghetto was liquidated, escaped to the woods, and rather than bona fide political credentials, because the home she came from was kind of an enlightened, half assimilated, as much Polish as Yiddish, semi-Zionist with a picture of Herzl apparently in the living room. What got her past that interview, and she describes it, is when all else failed, she said, I have a gun. And she did indeed have a gun, which they had secreted in the attic in Svincian, which there's a whole other story about the gun. And that got her into the partisans. And indeed, she was one of these women who was on a mission to blow up a train. And on that mission, lost the boyfriend with which she came into the partisan, and found her place emulating her martyred sister by becoming the nurse of that unit. And in that unit were Rivka's father and mother. There were also the poets Avram Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski in that unit. It became the ersatz family. It became the rootedness. It became the reason for being for that moment, because nobody really believed they were going to survive, but they were going to acquit themselves with honor. The unit also provided for other women and children, particularly, who took refuge in the swampy areas of the woods, who were not part of the fighting group.